The rain fell hard on Fort Bragg that November morning, and nobody noticed when Captain Sarah Mitchell didn't show up for roll call. Or rather, they noticed, but they didn't care. Sarah had been serving with the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron for nearly 15 years. She was a weapons officer, one of the finest A-10 Thunderbolt pilots in the entire Air Force. But on that morning in 2019, when her aircraft went down over enemy territory in a remote region of the Middle East, the military machinery that was supposed to protect her suddenly became her worst enemy. She had volunteered for the mission. That was the first thing everyone seemed to remember, the one detail they clung to like a shield. When pilots volunteered for dangerous runs, it meant something different to the higher-ups. It meant you accepted the risk. It meant that if things went wrong, well, that was on you. The official report came through 3 days later. Captain Sarah Mitchell, it said, had been killed in action. KIA, there was a memorial service. A few people cried. Her younger brother, Michael, sat in the front row of the chapel with tears running down his face. Her mother, Dorothy, sat beside him, holding his hand so tight her knuckles turned white. But Sarah wasn't dead. She was alive, hidden in a hospital in Germany, recovering from wounds that no one was supposed to know about. That's where things got complicated. Sarah woke up in a military hospital in Ramstein, Germany, 3 weeks after the crash. Her left leg was wrapped tight in bandages. Her right arm was in a cast. There were stitches along her ribs and a scar on her forehead that would never fully disappear. The pain was like nothing she had ever experienced before, but it was also proof that she was alive. A young Army nurse, Private First Class Jessica Torres, was there when Sarah's eyes first opened. Jessica was from San Antonio, Texas, with kind eyes and hands that knew how to work with pain. She had been assigned to Sarah's room specifically because of what was about to happen, because of what the military needed Jessica to keep quiet about. "Welcome back, Captain," Jessica said softly, checking the IV line that ran into Sarah's arm. "You've been asleep for a long time." "How long?" Sarah's voice was hoarse. Her throat felt like it had been scraped raw with sandpaper. 23 days, Jessica said. She was picking her words carefully. Sarah could tell by the way her jaw tightened. "You're at Ramstein, you're safe now." But even as Jessica said it, Sarah knew something was wrong. There was a federal agent stationed in the hallway outside her room, not to help her, to watch her. Over the next 2 weeks, as Sarah slowly regained strength, she pieced together what had happened. Her aircraft had gone down, yes. She had ejected from the damaged plane, but not where she was supposed to. Instead of landing in a secure zone where American forces could retrieve her, her chute had carried her deep into hostile territory. She had spent 4 days evading enemy fighters. She had hidden in caves and abandoned buildings. She had survived on water and the protein bars from her emergency kit. Then, by what Sarah had come to believe was pure luck, or perhaps divine intervention, a small group of Kurdish fighters had found her. They were American allies working with coalition forces. They had protected her, hidden her, and eventually gotten word to the American military that she was alive. But here was the problem, and it was a problem that went all the way to the top of the military command structure. The official report was already filed. Captain Sarah Mitchell was listed as KIA. The paperwork was done. The notifications had been made. Her family had already started the process of grieving. And somehow someone in the chain of command had decided that it would be a lot easier to keep her listed as dead than it would be to admit that a pilot, a woman pilot, had been lost in hostile territory and then rescued by Kurdish fighters instead of American forces. That made the military look bad. That raised questions about coordination. That created political problems. So they decided to let the lie stand. Jessica tried to be gentle when she explained some of this to Sarah. In whispered conversations after the evening shift ended, and the federal agent had left his post for a meal break. "There are people who want you to stay quiet," Jessica told her. "People with a lot of power. They're saying if you talk about this, if you go public with what happened, it could cause all kinds of trouble. For the military, for the political people who authorized the mission, for everyone." "What about my family?" Sarah asked. She could barely form the words. "My mother thinks I'm dead." Jessica looked away. That was answer enough. Back in the small town of Silver Springs, North Carolina, about 2 hours south of Fort Bragg, Sarah's mother Dorothy was drowning in grief. She had been a strong woman her whole life. She had raised 2 kids on her own after Sarah's father left when the kids were young. But this broke her in a way that nothing else ever had. The town gathered around her. That was what small towns did. Her neighbors brought casseroles and flowers. People from her church sat with her on the front porch in the evenings. The local news came out and did a story about the hero from Silver Springs who had given her life for her country. Sarah's younger brother Michael was different. Michael had joined the army himself, and he understood the military in a way that their mother didn't. He sat in his small apartment in Fayetteville near Fort Bragg, and he had a feeling that something wasn't right. It was a small feeling at first, like a whisper, but it grew louder every day. Michael went to the Air Force Base. He asked questions. He wanted to see his sister's service record. He wanted to know exactly what had happened. And every single time he hit a wall, classified, need-to-know basis, not available to immediate family. The answers came back smooth and polished like they had been prepared in advance. Sarah, meanwhile, was trapped in her hospital room in Germany. The federal agent was always nearby. The medical staff seemed to be operating under different orders than normal hospital procedure. She was being kept alive, yes, but she was also being kept prisoner. Jessica Torres was one of the few people who seemed to understand what was happening. She was young, only 24 years old, but she had integrity that went bone deep. She had joined the military to serve her country, and part of that service, she believed, was telling the truth. "I'm going to help you," Jessica told Sarah one night, about 6 weeks after Sarah had woken up. "I don't care what those people out there want. What they're doing is wrong, and somebody needs to tell the truth." "You'll lose your career," Sarah said. "Maybe," Jessica said, "but my grandmother always told me that some things are worth the cost." It took them another 3 weeks to plan it. The escape, if you could call it that, was surprisingly simple. Jessica was the night nurse. She doctored Sarah's pain medication to make it look like Sarah had taken it, but she actually held it back. When the federal agent was asleep, Jessica disconnected the various monitoring devices. She helped Sarah into clothes that had been hidden away piece by piece over weeks. She forged a discharge order and made it look official enough to pass a cursory glance. The hardest part was getting Sarah to the car without being noticed. Sarah's leg was still weak, still healing, but she was also a soldier trained for survival under pressure. She gritted her teeth and she moved. By 2 in the morning, Sarah was 3 hours away from Ramstein, in a small hotel room paid for with cash that Jessica had been saving. Jessica had her own car. She had her own plan. She was going to drive Sarah to a lawyer in Berlin who worked with military whistleblowers. From there, the rest would unfold according to the evidence and the truth. But Sarah didn't know the full extent of what was about to happen. She didn't know that her story was bigger than she thought. She didn't know that the cover-up ran deeper than just one mission gone wrong. She didn't know, yet, that there were powerful people who would do almost anything to keep her quiet. The lawyer's name was Hans Kellerman, and he had been defending military whistleblowers for nearly 30 years. His office was on the 3rd floor of a gray building in the Charlottenburg district of Berlin. When Jessica brought Sarah through the door, Hans took one look at Sarah's face, pale, determined, and marked by pain, and he knew that she was telling the truth. "Tell me everything," he said, and he set a recording device on the desk between them. It took 8 hours. Sarah went through the entire mission from beginning to end. The briefing, the intelligence report that she now believed was incomplete, the anti-aircraft fire that had come from an unexpected location, the ejection, the 4 days alone, the Kurdish fighters, the hospital in Germany, the federal agent, the order to keep quiet. Hans listened without interrupting. Jessica sat beside Sarah, holding her hand. When it was done, Hans leaned back in his chair and he took off his glasses. He rubbed his eyes. "This is serious," he said. "This is very serious. What you're describing is a conspiracy to obstruct justice. It's a cover-up that goes against military law. It involves the falsification of official reports. Do you understand what you're about to start?" "I understand that I'm supposed to be dead," Sarah said quietly. "And I understand that people want me to stay that way, at least in the official record. I'm tired of being a ghost." Hans nodded slowly. "Then we need to get you somewhere safe, and we need to tell your family that you're alive." The call to Dorothy Mitchell came on a Tuesday afternoon. Dorothy was sitting in her living room working on a quilt when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick it up. "Mom." Dorothy's hands went numb. The quilt fell to the floor. "Sarah." "It's me, Mom. I'm alive. I'm sorry it took so long to tell you, but I'm alive and I need you to help me." Dorothy started to cry. She couldn't speak for a long time. When she finally could, all she said was, "Where are you?" "I'm safe. I'm in Europe. We're working on a way to expose the truth about what happened to me. But I need you to do something for me. I need you to call Michael. And I need you to prepare for when this all comes out. Because it's going to be big, Mom. The military didn't just lose me. They lost me and then they lied about it." The conversation lasted for 45 minutes. By the end, Dorothy understood the situation. Her daughter wasn't dead. She was alive, but she was also in danger. And the only way to protect her was to tell the truth to as many people as possible. Michael came to Silver Springs that night. He hadn't seen his mother in person for 3 months, not since the memorial service for his sister. When he walked through the door and saw her face, and saw that her eyes were red but this time from crying for a different reason, he knew something had changed. They sat together and Dorothy told him everything. Michael listened quietly, and when she finished, he took a breath and he said, "Sarah always was smarter than all of us, and braver. If anyone was going to take on the military machine and win, it would be her." But winning wasn't going to be easy. Hans Kellerman filed Sarah's case with several different organizations simultaneously. He contacted the International Criminal Court. He sent documents to human rights organizations. He prepared a comprehensive report and sent it to journalists at major news outlets. He also filed a formal complaint with the Inspector General of the United States Air Force. The response from the military came within 48 hours. An official delegation flew to Berlin. They met with Hans in his office, and their message was simple and delivered with the kind of calm firmness that only comes from absolute institutional power. "Captain Mitchell has violated multiple federal laws by leaving a secure military facility without authorization. She has breached classified information by discussing a military mission with unauthorized civilians. She has committed treason by cooperating with foreign nationals to undermine military operations. She needs to surrender herself immediately, or she will be charged in absentia." But they also made an offer. If Sarah would come back, if she would recant her story, if she would accept a medical discharge and sign a non-disclosure agreement, then all of this would go away. She could go home. She could try to have a normal life. All she had to do was lie. Hans came to the safe house where Sarah was now staying, a small apartment in the Schöneberg district of Berlin, paid for by the human rights organizations that had taken on her case, and he told her what the military had said. Sarah listened, and then she asked to call her mother. Dorothy was in the kitchen when the phone rang. She had been standing there for the past 3 hours, just standing and thinking. When she heard Sarah's voice, she felt the weight in her chest get a little bit lighter. "They want me to come back and lie," Sarah said. "They want me to disappear into the system, and I'm scared, Mom. I'm scared of what they might do to me if I don't." "Then we make sure everyone knows," Dorothy said. She surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. "If everyone knows, then they can't touch you. They can't disappear you again, because everyone will be watching." "How do we do that?" "We tell your story," Dorothy said. "We tell it loud, and we tell it where everyone can hear it." Dorothy Mitchell became a force of nature. She contacted every news outlet she could find. She gave interviews to journalists. She posted on social media. She organized a press conference in the town square of Silver Springs. She talked to her congressmen. She talked to senators. She talked to anyone who would listen. And slowly, the story started to spread. The first significant break came when an investigative journalist named Rebecca Chen, who worked for a major national news organization, decided to pursue the story. Rebecca was known for her dogged approach to military accountability stories. She reached out to Hans Kellerman. She requested interviews. She started digging into the official records. What Rebecca found was deeply troubling. The official report on Sarah's mission had been modified at least 3 times. The chain of custody on the classified documents related to the mission appeared to be broken. There were communications between high-ranking officials that suggested they knew Sarah was alive before the official story about her death was released. Rebecca also discovered something else. Sarah's wasn't the only case. Over the past decade, there had been at least 7 other military personnel whose deaths had been reported and then, years later, quietly altered in the records. In each case, a cover-up had been involved. In each case, the individuals involved had been pressured to stay quiet. This wasn't just about Sarah. This was about a systematic pattern of military misconduct that had been hidden from the public. Rebecca's first article ran on the front page of the national news website on a Tuesday morning. The headline read, "The Soldiers Who Came Back, Military Cover-Ups and the Families Left Behind." Within hours, the story went viral. Morning talk shows picked it up. Cable news networks ran segments. By Thursday, the Secretary of the Air Force had announced that an official investigation was being launched. And Sarah, sitting in her small apartment in Berlin, watching the news coverage, felt something shift inside her. She was no longer alone. She was no longer a classified problem to be solved quietly. She was a soldier whose story mattered, and it was being told. But the military wasn't going to give up, not yet. They had too much to lose. The investigation revealed that a four-star general named Raymond Blackwood, who had since retired and was working as a consultant for a major defense contractor, had personally authorized the falsification of Sarah's death. He had done it to protect himself and other commanders who had authorized a mission that was poorly planned and inadequately supported. When Sarah crashed and had to be rescued by Kurdish fighters instead of American forces, it made the entire chain of command look incompetent. General Blackwood denied everything. He lawyered up. His team claimed he was being scapegoated. They said the military was trying to throw a retired general under the bus to protect the current leadership. But there was one problem with that defense. There were emails. There were official memorandums. There were telephone records. There was a paper trail of the conspiracy that was impossible to explain away. As the evidence mounted, the pressure intensified. Military personnel began to cooperate with investigators, revealing details about how the cover-up had been managed. Logistics officers talked about how supply reports were falsified. Communications specialists described how secure channels were used to coordinate the deception. Medical personnel, including people who knew that Sarah was alive and receiving care, began to share what they knew. And in Germany, Sarah slowly began to heal not just physically but also emotionally. For the first time since that day when her plane went down, she felt like she had her agency back. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was fighting. Jessica Torres, the young Army nurse who had helped Sarah escape, was given a medal by a human rights organization and was invited to speak about military ethics at universities. Her act of conscience had become an inspiration to others in the military who had witnessed wrongdoing and didn't know how to respond. By the summer of 2020, the military announced that it was filing charges against General Raymond Blackwood. He was charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and falsification of official military documents. He was also charged with making false statements to federal investigators. The trial was going to be a spectacle. It was going to expose details about military misconduct that the public had never seen before. But Sarah knew something that the military didn't know yet. She knew that the trial was only going to be the beginning, because there was something about her crash that still hadn't been fully explained. There was something about the intelligence failure, about why her aircraft had been in such a vulnerable position, that went even deeper into the chain of command. And there was someone else who knew the truth about what had really happened. Someone who had been silent for a long time, but who was about to be forced to speak. Colonel David Hansen had been Sarah's commanding officer at the 58th Tactical Fighter Squadron. He was a career military man, someone who had served with distinction for 32 years. He had 3 kids in college and a wife named Margaret who did volunteer work at the base hospital. He was, by all accounts, a good man who had spent his life in service to his country. He was also directly involved in the decision to place Sarah in a vulnerable position during that fateful mission. For months after Sarah's crash, Colonel Hansen had gone through his days like a ghost. He attended meetings. He filed reports. He put on his uniform every morning, but inside something had broken. He had known that Sarah was alive. 3 days after her crash, he had received notification through back channels that she had been recovered by Allied forces in Germany. He had been instructed, in no uncertain terms, not to report this to Sarah's family or to the press. He had been told that if he did, he would face court-martial. He had been told that his pension would be revoked. He had been told that he would lose everything. So he had stayed quiet. He had participated in the memorial service. He had given the eulogy about Sarah's bravery and sacrifice. He had looked Dorothy Mitchell in the eye and told her that her daughter had died a hero. But the lie had gnawed at him. It had kept him awake at night. It had poisoned his relationship with his wife. Margaret had noticed the change in him. She had asked what was wrong. He couldn't tell her. He couldn't tell anyone. When Sarah's story broke in the news, when the investigation began, Colonel Hansen was contacted by the Inspector General's office. They wanted to interview him about his knowledge of the mission and the subsequent cover-up. He had a choice to make. He could maintain his silence and hope that the investigation didn't reach him, or he could tell the truth. He chose to tell the truth. Colonel Hansen's testimony was devastating. He described the mission parameters, or rather, the parameters that Sarah had been given. He revealed that intelligence about enemy anti-aircraft positions in the area had been incomplete. He explained that he had raised concerns about Sarah's vulnerability during the mission brief, but that his concerns had been overruled by higher command. And then he said something that changed everything. I was told that if I reported Captain Mitchell as alive, I would face charges of treason. I was told that the cover-up was happening on orders from the Joint Chiefs. I was told that this was above my pay grade and that I should shut up and accept it. And I did. I shut up. And now I have to live with the fact that I betrayed one of the finest soldiers I have ever served with. That betrayal is the worst thing I have ever done in my life. As he gave his testimony, Colonel Hansen cried, not quietly but openly. The whole room witnessed it. That testimony became the cornerstone of the investigation. If a commander of Colonel Hansen's standing was willing to admit that he had been pressured to participate in a cover-up, then there had to be something real there. There had to be something substantial worth covering up. The investigation went higher, much higher. It turned out that the order to falsify Sarah's death records had come from General Raymond Blackwood, but Blackwood had been acting on instructions from someone else, someone even higher up in the command structure. The investigation led to the office of a 3-star admiral named Patricia Waverly, who had been in charge of strategic operations for the entire theater where Sarah's mission had taken place. Admiral Waverly was retired by the time the investigation reached her. She was living in San Diego with her husband, a former pilot himself. When federal investigators came to her door, she at first refused to cooperate. But when faced with the mountain of evidence, including emails and memorandums and testimony from dozens of other military officers, she finally agreed to be interviewed. I was trying to protect the mission, Admiral Waverly said in her official statement. I believed that if we admitted what had happened, that we had lost a pilot in a poorly coordinated operation, it would damage public confidence in our military operations. I believed that it was better to contain the situation, to manage the information, to protect the overall strategic goals. You believed it was better to lie to the American people, the investigator said flatly. I believed I was making the hard choices that leadership sometimes requires, Admiral Waverly responded. But when asked directly about General Blackwood and his role, Admiral Waverly revealed that she had explicitly told Blackwood to handle the situation and make it go away. She had understood what that meant. She had known what Blackwood would do. She had ordered a cover-up. The charges were expanded. Admiral Waverly was now charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice and with making false statements to Congress, because she had testified before Congress about military operations in the region and had failed to mention any of the irregularities with Sarah's mission. This was not a case of one general going rogue. This was a conspiracy that involved multiple high-ranking officers and multiple levels of command. Meanwhile, Sarah was preparing to return to the United States to testify at the trial. Her physical healing had progressed remarkably. Her leg was strong again, though she would always have a limp. Her arm had healed. The psychological wounds were deeper, but she was working with a military therapist on those. The military base at Fort Bragg was preparing for her arrival, but this time, it wasn't as a disgraced soldier or a prisoner. It was as a hero. The base commander had extended an invitation for Sarah to speak to the entire squadron about her experience. Local media was requesting interviews. There was talk of a book deal and a potential documentary about her story. But Sarah just wanted to get home. She wanted to see her mother. She wanted to sit on her mother's porch in Silver Springs and drink sweet tea and talk about normal things, like what was growing in the garden and what was happening with the neighbors. Dorothy had prepared Sarah's childhood bedroom for her return. She had cleaned it and decorated it with fresh flowers. She had filled the refrigerator with all of Sarah's favorite foods. She had cried a lot while preparing, tears of joy that her daughter was coming home, and tears of sadness for all the time that had been stolen from them by a lie. When Sarah's plane landed at Fayetteville Regional Airport, there was a crowd waiting for her. Local news cameras, military personnel in dress uniforms. Dorothy, standing with her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Sarah made her way through the crowd toward her mother, and when their arms came together, Dorothy held on like she would never let go. That embrace lasted for 2 full minutes, and during those 2 minutes, there wasn't a dry eye in the airport. Even the federal marshals who were there to ensure Sarah's security were visibly moved. "Welcome home, baby," Dorothy whispered into her daughter's hair. "It's good to be home, Mom." The trial began in August. It was held at a federal courthouse in Raleigh, North Carolina, which meant Sarah could stay with her mother in Silver Springs and make the short drive to the courthouse each day. The prosecution's case was clear and overwhelming. They presented the emails, the memorandums, the testimony of dozens of military personnel. They showed how the conspiracy had been executed, step by step. They established a clear chain of command and responsibility. General Blackwood's lawyers argued that he was following orders, that he was doing what he believed was necessary, that he was being scapegoated. But the evidence was too strong. The prosecution even presented testimony from Admiral Waverly, who, in exchange for a reduced sentence, had agreed to testify against Blackwood. Sarah took the stand for 3 days. She described the mission. She described what had happened when her plane was hit. She described her 4 days alone in hostile territory. She described waking up in the hospital in Germany and being told to keep quiet. She described the emotional toll of being officially dead while secretly alive. When the prosecution asked her how this experience had affected her, Sarah thought for a moment before answering. "Made me understand something about power," she said. "Power isn't just about who has the most weapons or the most money. Real power is the ability to make people believe a lie. Real power is the ability to control information. But that kind of power is fragile. It only works as long as people remain silent. The moment people start telling the truth, that power breaks apart. And that's what I learned. The truth might not come easy and it might not come fast, but it's stronger than any lie. In the end, the truth wins." The jury deliberated for 5 days. Then they came back with their verdict. General Raymond Blackwood was found guilty on all counts. He faced up to 40 years in federal prison. Admiral Patricia Waverly, who had struck a plea deal, received 15 years. Colonel David Hanson, because he had been cooperative with the investigation and had testified truthfully, was given immunity in exchange for his testimony and was allowed to retire with full honors. The courtroom erupted when the verdict was read. Sarah sat with her mother and Dorothy gripped her daughter's hand. They had won, not just for Sarah but for the system itself. They had stood up to the military machine and had forced it to tell the truth. But Sarah knew something that nobody else in that courtroom knew yet. Something that she had discovered while going through classified files as part of the investigation's preparation. Something that explained why her aircraft had been in such a vulnerable position during that mission. There was one more layer to this conspiracy, and it involved weapons, money, and corruption that went beyond just military misconduct. It involved someone she had trusted. 3 weeks after the verdict, Sarah received a phone call from Rebecca Chen, the investigative journalist who had first broken the story. "I've been looking at something," Rebecca said without preamble. "Something about the defense contractor that was awarded the contract for the new A-10 systems that were supposed to be tested during your mission." Sarah's stomach tightened. She had a feeling she knew where this was going. "What did you find?" "Financial connections between Admiral Waverly's family and the defense contractor," Rebecca said. "Her husband consults for them. Her sister is on the board. And here's the interesting part. The contract was worth $700 million. $700 million. And it was awarded right after your mission, right after everything got locked down and classified." Sarah sat down. She had never made this connection before. She had been so focused on the cover-up that she hadn't looked deeper to ask the question, why? Why had they been so desperate to bury her story? What were they really protecting? "What kind of systems were being tested?" Sarah asked. "That's classified," Rebecca said. "But I've got a source inside the Pentagon who says the systems failed. They didn't work the way they were supposed to work. In fact, your source of the anti-aircraft fire, that came from a new air defense system that the contractor was claiming worked perfectly. But it worked better than anyone expected. So good that it shot down an American plane with an American pilot." Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. "Are you saying the weapons system that was supposed to protect me is what shot me down?" That's exactly what I'm saying, Rebecca said. And if that becomes public, if people find out that the military covered up friendly fire involving experimental weapons systems, if it becomes known that the military falsified records specifically to protect a defense contractor's $700 million contract, this thing goes from bad to catastrophic. This was the kind of scandal that could shake the entire foundation of how the military did business with private contractors. Sarah called Hans Kellerman in Berlin. He listened to her explanation, and then he was quiet for a long time. "This is bigger than the criminal case," he finally said. "This goes to civil liability. This goes to who bears responsibility for billions of dollars of taxpayer money being wasted on systems that don't work. We need to file a civil suit against the contractor, against the military, against all of them." But before they could move forward with that, something happened that nobody anticipated. General Raymond Blackwood had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a reduced sentence from the 40 years he initially faced, because the court took into account his age and his prior service. He was being held at a federal correctional facility in North Carolina, about 2 hours from Silver Springs. One morning, while Blackwood was in the prison yard, he was attacked by another inmate. The attack was vicious and brutal. By the time the guards separated them, Blackwood had suffered multiple stab wounds. He died an hour later in the prison hospital. The official report said it was gang violence, that Blackwood had been targeted at random. But Sarah knew better. She knew that Blackwood had powerful friends on the outside. She knew that there were people who wanted to make sure he didn't talk about anything else. She knew that in this kind of situation, loose ends got tied up. She went to Michael. They sat in her mother's living room, and she told him about the weapons system connection, about Admiral Waverly's family ties to the defense contractor, about Blackwood's death in prison. Michael, who had continued his military service while everything else was happening, had sources of his own. He used those sources to confirm what Rebecca had found. He discovered more. There were other officers, people who had known about the weapons system failure, who had also died under mysterious circumstances. A plane crash, a car accident, a sudden heart attack that happened to occur right before the person was scheduled to give a deposition. "This isn't just corruption," Michael said. "This is organized crime. This is the kind of thing that happens at the top of military-industrial complex." Sarah made a decision. She was going to file a lawsuit, not just a military one, but a civilian lawsuit against the defense contractor and against the military officials who had protected them. She was going to do it publicly. She was going to make sure that everyone knew what was happening. Hans Kellerman filed the lawsuit in federal court. Sarah Mitchell versus Blackwell Defense Systems Incorporated versus the United States Department of Defense versus Admiral Patricia Waverly versus 17 other named defendants. The suit alleged that the military had covered up a friendly fire incident to protect a defense contractor's lucrative government contract. It alleged that evidence had been destroyed. It alleged that military officers had been pressured into silence. It alleged that when those military officers tried to break their silence, they were threatened with courts-martial and loss of pension. The suit asked for $2 billion in damages. The response from the defendants was immediate and aggressive. Blackwell Defense Systems denied everything. The military issued a statement saying the lawsuit was baseless and would be dismissed. The remaining defendants' lawyers filed motions to dismiss on the grounds that military operations were protected from civilian legal action. But public opinion was not on the side of the defendants. Rebecca Chen published a follow-up article in her national news organization, this time focusing on the weapons system failure and the potential cover-up to protect corporate interests. The story went viral. There were calls for congressional investigations. There were demands for transparency. The House Armed Services Committee opened an inquiry. They subpoenaed officials from Blackwell Defense Systems. They demanded access to classified information about the weapons systems. They called for testimony from military officials. One of those officials was Colonel David Hansen. Sarah's former commanding officer appeared before Congress and told them everything he knew about how the intelligence failures had led to a dangerous mission briefing. He talked about how Sarah had raised concerns during the briefing, but had been overridden by command. He talked about how, after the fact, people had begun raising questions about whether the new weapons system might have been responsible for the aircraft being shot down. "I never wanted to believe that our own weapons could have done this," Colonel Hansen told the committee. But the evidence kept pointing in that direction, and when I raised the issue, I was told to stop asking questions. I was told that this was a classified matter and that national security was at stake. But I think what was really at stake was a $700 million contract. The media frenzy grew. The weapons system manufacturer found itself under intense public scrutiny. Their CEO resigned. Their stock price plummeted. Investors began demanding answers about the failure of their systems and the military's response. And through it all, Sarah remained steady. She gave interviews. She told her story. She appeared on national news programs. She became the face of military accountability. But she also became something else, a target. The threats started small, anonymous messages on social media, veiled comments from military bloggers suggesting that she was a traitor. But then they escalated. A brick came through her mother's living room window with a note attached. "Stop talking." Michael installed security cameras on the house. He changed the locks. He was with Sarah and Dorothy constantly, trying to make sure they were safe. Then came the incident that changed everything. Sarah was driving home from a meeting with Hans Kellerman in Raleigh when a car came out of nowhere and rammed into her from behind. It was a hit and run. Sarah's car went off the road and into a ditch. The other car sped away before anyone could get a license plate number. Sarah was hospitalized with broken ribs and a head injury. It was serious, but she survived. The police investigated, but there were no witnesses, no clear leads. It was an accident, the police said, probably someone driving recklessly. But Sarah and Michael both knew better. Someone was trying to silence her. Someone still had a lot to lose if the truth kept spreading.